You're listening to Radical Minds on WHPK 88.5 FM, the pride of the South Side. It's currently 3:01 p.m. Today we're going to be interviewing Professor Kevin B. Anderson, author of a recent book published by the University of Chicago Press, Marx at the Margins, on Nationalism, Ethnicity, and Non-Western Societies. With Professor Anderson, we're going to be discussing the question of Marx's relationship to Marx's understanding of the fact that capitalism emerges in some parts of the world and not in others, that of course it emerges in Europe and to a degree on account of European expansion. It also emerges here in North America in a very profound and dynamic way over the course of the early modern period through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries until the rise of industrialism, which of course is the context for Marx's writings in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. Professor Anderson has been an editor for a worldwide project of editing the writings of Marx and Engels, complete in their original languages, and I think supervising editor of a forthcoming English edition, which promises to supersede the edition in that we currently work with in English. Hopefully, we'll now be able to hear Professor Anderson. Kevin, are you there?
Yes, I am, Spencer. How are you?
Oh, I am great, and I'm amazed at my ability to actually make this studio soundboard work. Okay, so we are live on the air, and actually, before you joined us, I mentioned your book. I'll do that again. We're going to be discussing today Kevin Anderson's 2010 University of Chicago publication, Marx at the Margins, on Nationalism, Ethnicity, and Non-Western Societies. And we're going to go into some detail about the book, but I believe first I should give Professor Anderson an opportunity to take a few minutes to broadly describe his aims and ambitions in writing this book. So give our listeners, please, an introduction to the book in general, your primary purposes, Kevin.
One aim was, of course, political and with a little bit of an activist bent, which was connected to the fact that in the past couple decades, really about 3 decades since the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism, there have been a number of critiques of Marx in the academy that centered on charges of Eurocentrism, ethnocentrism, so forth. And I wanted to respond to those and also look at Marx anew in the light of those critiques. The second aim was scholarly. There have been various works on Marx and nationalism, on Marx and Russia in his late writings, on Marx on India and China, but no one had Marx on the Civil War in the United States, which deals with ethnicity. But no one had put all these concerns and issues together in a single study, which I wanted to do. Also taking account of the some newly surfaced writings of Marx that are going to eventually appear in the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, which actually Spencer was I'm working on this volume that will eventually appear, and Spencer, you also did some work on that, on the portions on India.
Mm-hmm. I remember it well. Okay. Let me take up your first comment, if I may, regarding Eurocentrism. Can you hear me well, Kevin?
Yes, fine.
Okay, good. Eurocentrism, this seems to me a particularly fraught matter, one that has been used, as you say, to raise objections not only to Marx, it must be said, but also to the Enlightenment tradition in which all critical theory finds its roots, and most crucially, for Marx, the British political economy tradition, the French philosophes, and the political enlightenment more generally, and German idealism, above all Kant and Hegel. In your book, rather than dismissing the charge of Eurocentrism on grounds of its being motivated largely by what we as leftists might consider dubious projects of third world nationalism, instead takes the charge seriously as one that not only merits serious consideration in its own right, but as one from which Marx and Engels themselves are not wholly immune, on account of what you term the unilinearity of their early writings, above all the Communist Manifesto and the Tribune writings of the early 1850s. But is the category of the West really a significant one, either for Marx or the Enlightenment more generally?
Well, I think certainly there are places where that's the case, such as some of the 1853 India writings where he talks of England as a superior civilization to India that's going to revolutionize India as a result of the higher form of economic development that it's bringing to India, and so on and so forth. And there's also the sense there's a sentence in the preface to Capital which says the industrially more developed countries show to the less developed the image of their own future. So that would suggest almost, or if you want to think of in terms of a railroad train, that the Western European countries in North America are kind of in the front couple cars of the train, and Asia and the so-called Third World are toward the back of the train being pulled forward into modernity.
Mm-hmm. So that all countries would, in a sense, recapitulate the historical trajectory of those at the head of the train. Right.
And of course, in its most simplistic model, no one supports it. No one would ever say that India is going to become an exact copy of England. But to the extent that one would say that England, countries like India, the United States, later on, represent the future of humanity, that can be considered a Eurocentric model. I think it's just really simply at that level that people talk about it. Now, the people that are very critical of Eurocentrism, one of the problems, there's many problems with them, but one of the problems is that they're often very critical of the social structures and social institutions of modern Western societies, but far less critical of the social structures and institutions of the non-West. So Marx, in examining these so-called non-Western societies, is always critical. In the early writings, he's critical in such a way that could be called Eurocentric, but even in his later writings, where you could argue, or I've tried to argue, that he moves to a more multilinear perspective, he's never a primitivist anarchist, who's interested in going back to some kind of clan-based, low-tech society, nor does he idealize the social formations in places like India, with their rigid, internally generated social hierarchies, the subordinate position of women. That takes particularly virulent forms in some of those societies. He doesn't sugarcoat any of that. Nonetheless, toward the end of his life, there's evidence that he entertains more of a possibility of societies evolving and revolutionizing themselves as well on the basis of indigenous institutions. Never entirely so, of course, but giving a little more weight to the indigenous, internally generated institutions of these societies.
I understand a lot of what you're saying, and I agree with a certain impulse there. But it does seem to me that when Marx is saying that, for instance, England represents a higher civilization in its colonial encounter with India, that he's not really talking about culture or anything about England that, extends into the distant past, or anything that might really be termed, in a sense, authentically Western at all. But that what is not only, in a sense, a superior civilization, but really what Marx, in a lot of writings, just calls civilization, is capitalism. That and you get this rhetoric in the Communist Manifesto where he'll use the language of capitalism or civilization to, by contrast, term everything else barbaric or barbarism. As for instance,
right.
In the famous passage where he, talks about the beating down of Chinese walls by commodity exports and the like. And so it does seem to me that, there is there are all kinds of reasons that one might think of in terms of, his attempt to write for a newspaper audience or whatever, but it does seem to me that when he's using that language, he's talking about a social form that, in a sense, just happens to have emerged in Europe. What do you think about that?
Well, of course, there's some truth in that. It's just that it sometimes verges over into language that I think we would consider today to be ethnocentric. Some of those descriptions of India as an unchanging, unresisting society which has no history except that imposed by its foreign conquerors, so on and so forth. I mean, you're as familiar with these texts probably as I am, at least some of them. So there just are some problems with it. Let me give another example that you may not be aware of.
Okay.
This is very early, and actually it's by Engels, but there's no reason to believe that Marx disagreed at that point. He applauds the U.S. war in Mexico and the conquest of California and incorporation of the Southwest and West into the United States, and even uses the phrase the lazy Mexicans, quote unquote, who were unable to develop California, but now the North Americans, the U.S. is going to be able to do that. That kind of language reverses by the 1860s and 70s. You can see a real turn there on so many of these different issues. I mean, as far as ethnocentrism, you can also look at the writings frequently by Engels, but also on occasion by Marx, about Russia and the Balkans and the characterization of some of the people like the Czechs, the Serbs, the Russians, the ethnic Russians, as really barbaric peoples with no history, and that it's good that in some areas that they're dominated by the Germans, because the Germans are a higher civilization and are a historic nation, that these nations are destined to disappear, which is a good thing. Now, there are exceptions even in the early writings to this kind of thinking, and I think wherever they're actually in contact with real movements, real historical movements of resistance that are at all progressive, they change their tune fairly quickly. And for example, in Ireland, I've never found anything in any of their writings which which suggests any sympathy for any so-called progress that Britain is bringing to Ireland. But Engels especially was intimately involved in Ireland. I mean, as early as the condition of the working class in England, 1845, which describes Manchester, Engels devotes a lot of attention to the Irish subproletariat inside Manchester, its special oppression, and also is writing in Marx, too, a little bit about the Irish national movement inside Ireland, at that point not for independence, but for greater rights for the Irish within the empire.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems to me that in some ways, Marx, it raises the question, as I tried to indicate before, of Marx's and Engels's inheritance of a situation that's, in a sense, forever foreign to us, but one that they shared in part with the radical Enlightenment precursors that they admired so much, which is that, unlike today, they lived in a time when the whole world was not bourgeois, when the world was not modern, and that it seems to me that part of the struggle of not just Marx and Engels, but going back into Hegel, Kant, Adam Smith, Rousseau, is a struggle to critically apprehend the specificity of modern society.
Mm-hmm.
And that as that recognition of the specificity of modern society, which in some ways grows out of the debate between the ancients and the moderns, as that dawns, people, major European intellectuals of freedom and emancipation, are confronted with the fact that their society is expanding, and that no other society seems capable of genuinely resisting that expansion. Hegel has his comments about the North American Indians, that sort of fall, like, I think he says, they sort of fall at the breath of European civilization, and of course Adam Smith was extremely impressed by the fact of a small number of Englishmen in the East India Company's ability to conquer major portions of a sort of historically known empire in Asia, that of the Mughals, and so it's really a question, it seems to me, of the difference between our perspective and their perspective is that they had to contemplate something that we don't contemplate, shouldn't have no need of contemplating, which is what if this society that we live in gives rise to its own potential? What if its own highest potential is brought forward, and as Marx and Engels would understand that, socialism? What if there's a revolution in Europe before capitalism has spread to the rest of the world? Right?
Right. This is one of their great worries, actually. Marx does, and that last point, Marx does express that a few times, that if radical communism, or radical democracy even calls it at some stages, could overtake this small sliver of society, of the world that has become modernized and along capitalist lines, that it would be smothered very quickly by the rest of the world. So he's actually worried about that. He's particularly worried about Russia. See, one of the contexts in which he operates, we look back and we see England as the predominant power, but in political terms in Europe, Russia was the second most important power after England. And don't forget that the 1848 revolutions were defeated in large part, or in substantial part, because Russia was able to send 400,000 troops into the Austro-Hungarian Empire to aid the old regime to come back to power. So, yeah, they're very concerned with the fact that there's only a sliver of modernity which is producing the modern workers' movement and so on. But this is a tiny sliver of humanity. And so what's going to happen, in one of those, if that remains an isolated phenomenon? So on the one hand, they are happy about the spread of modernity, capitalism, and even to a certain extent colonialism throughout the world, especially in their early writing. But as they develop, as Marx moves in the 1850s toward the completion of Grundrisse and then Capital, I think I've argued, and I'm not the first to argue this, that the critique of capitalism becomes more intense, becomes sharper, becomes deeper, becomes more unremitting, in the sense that in the Communist Manifesto we have those lines about the progressivism of capitalism, especially the first few pages. You find that language only in very muted form in Capital Volume 1, a little bit more so in the Grundrisse, but if you look at the trajectory of Marx's writings, you find less enthusiasm about progress emerging out of capitalist modernity as he goes on. In fact, you talk about Marx in the context of his times. Marx had not lived in England yet when he penned the Communist Manifesto. Mm-hmm. He hadn't experienced directly that high development of capitalist modernity. Maybe from the outside he even idealized it a little bit. That's a very strange thing to say about Marx. But if you look at the opening pages of the Manifesto, it does heap great praise on what he sees as the achievements of capitalism. So I've argued in my book that there's a gradual shift on these issues, never toward an uncritical third worldism, never toward a primitivist anarchism or anything like that, but a shift toward a harsher critique of capitalist modernity and greater appreciation of some of the achievements and contributions of these societies at the edges of capitalism.
Can I just...
And then this thing about Kant and Rousseau and so forth, I could also address. It's a very interesting question, but I don't want to just have this be a monologue.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me come back and actually pick up on exactly what you're saying now. You discuss in the book what you term Marx's growing disillusionment with capitalism, in the sense that he no longer held as strong a belief in capitalism's progressive effects. I'm quoting you. This would seem to indicate a major shift in Marx's thinking. But in what sense did Marx ever think capitalism progressive that he ceased to think was true at a later time? It seems, for instance, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx had argued that with the coming of capitalism, all fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away, all that's solid melts into air, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind, where he seems to be celebrating the fact of capitalism's having swept the past away and giving rise to the possibility of its self-overcoming, of our confrontation with our circumstances, with, as he puts it, sober senses. And that capitalism is the ground that makes possible, the conclusion of prehistory, of the prehistory of man, through a deliberate act of masses of men achieving a post-capitalist society. Do you think that Marx's attitude about that ever substantially changed? That to me seems the heart of, that the bourgeoisie, as he says, has played a most revolutionary part precisely to the extent that it's laid the groundwork for capitalism's proving to be a transitional form to another society, that he never celebrates capitalism as progressive in and of itself.
Right. It's
I'm very defensive of the Communist Manifesto.
To be the next. Yeah. I mean, and even in the manifesto, where his praise is at the highest. I mean, even in those paragraphs you were quoting about sober senses and so forth, there's the phrase "the icy waters of individual calculation," which I don't think he means as a compliment to capitalism and its culture.
No.
Okay.
You don't think it's cold water as a kind of waking up? I mean,
I think what I'm trying to make is a larger point, that
please,
even in that language about progressivism, it's always dialectical. And part of the way that the manifesto is set up is that the first few pages set out this model, and then the next few pages undermine it by talking about all the contradictions and oppressions brought about by capitalism, such as making the worker a mere instrument of the machine, the recessions and depressions that capitalism creates, and that it's unfit to rule because it can't guarantee to the subordinate population, even the proletariat, even the minimal level of existence. And so all that language is there too. But as you were saying, I think in the manifesto there's very clear language that to the effect that you sort of have to go through this process, right? In the later writings, that's less clear. The most dramatic example of that, or obvious example of that, is in the late writings on Russia, where the Russian villages, Russia's still an overwhelmingly rural country, but they're starting to be encroached upon by capitalist property relations. Capitalist banking systems are starting to be set up, and of course, not in Marx's day, but you can see on the horizon the glimmers of what was to become a certain level of industrialization in Russia by the 1890s. Marx dies in 1883, so he didn't live to see that. So, but if you look at those writings on Russia, Marx suggests that if the villages can resist this, the incursions of capitalism, that this might be a good thing. So this is very unusual. He talks about the communal structure of the Russian villages. They're more collectivist social forms even than in the medieval European village, let alone modern capitalist social relations. And he sees that as a possible building block for communism of a modern type. It does have sort of what he considers to be a primitive communist structure anyway, but he sees it as a possible building block for a modern communism if Russia can be revolutionized on the basis of the resistance of these villages to the central state. And there was a revolutionary movement going on at that time, the populists, that was trying exactly to do that. And if it can link up with the proletarian revolutions of the West, which he's anticipating. So we have a very different kind of thing here where not everyone has to go through necessarily this painful uprooting process of the old social relations, as happens with the Industrial Revolution and the kinds of things he's talking about in the opening pages of the manifesto. And I think there's wider implications. I mean, that's just the most dramatic example, but there's a lot of other examples that one could point to that are less dramatic in the later writings. These writings I'm referring to are 1881 and 82, just before his death.
Let me, on this theme, bring in Hegel.
Sure.
While you were talking, I was just pulling up a quote that I like from the lectures on the philosophy of history, where Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history, where he says, without rhetorical exaggeration, a simply truthful combination of the miseries that have overwhelmed the noblest of nations and polities and the finest examples of private virtue forms a picture of the most fearful aspect and excites emotions of the profoundest and most hopeless sadness. counterbalanced by no consolatory result. We endure in beholding it a mental torture, allowing no defense or escape, but the consideration that what has happened could not be otherwise, that it is a fatality which no intervention could alter, and at last we draw back from the intolerable disgust with which these sorrowful reflections threaten us, into the more agreeable environment of our private individual life, the present formed by our aims and interests. In short, we retreat into selfishness that stands on the quiet shore and thence enjoys in safety the distant spectacle of wrecks confusedly hurled. But even regarding history as the slaughter bench at which the happiness of peoples, the wisdom of states, and the virtue of individuals have been victimized, the question involuntarily arises, to what principle, to what final aim these enormous sacrifices have been offered? From this point, the investigation proceeds. It seems to me that, in a way, in terms of what you're saying, Marx inherits that very profoundly. For instance, in the statement, that all hitherto existing history has been the history of class struggle. But it also seems to me that his theory of capital, his critical theory of capitalism, reconfigures that concern somewhat. And in particular, it raises the question of not only the suffering of all of human history, of all of world history, which for some, at least in one corner of the world, involved the terrible suffering involved in giving rise to industrial capitalism, which in some, as Hegel says, in some unconsoling and unconsolable way is just a historical fact, a deeply melancholy one. But that Marx also has the question of what about when this suffering is no longer necessary? What about, in a sense, the post-1848 world? I mean, I guess if to me, the manifesto is, in some ways, pre-1848. I'm wondering how you feel about this, that in some ways it's the failure of 1848. It's the failure of the working class and, if indeed humanity, to rise to the historical tasks of industrial society. That is, in a sense, the most deeply melancholy fact for Marx. And that it might be in that light that we look at his descriptions of the barbarities committed in India or in China or elsewhere. How do you feel about that?
Well, yeah, Marx is a child of Hegel in that respect, certainly. I mean, that's a very famous quote you just read out about that. I mean, usually people focus on the phrase the slaughter bench of history, that kind of soundbite within it. But the language about fatality and so forth. I would just say that Hegel is also the philosopher of the human subject. So he's interested in quests for freedom, quests for self-determination, and so forth throughout his writings as well. So it operates within, of course, a larger framework, and all of it adds up to some kind of historical progression, as Hegel sees it. But of course, even with Hegel, the progress is never one-sided. Hegel has room for retrogression within his concept of historical development. He regards, for example, the entire European medieval period as a period of retrogression, as a pretty long period of history. So neither Hegel nor Marx are the uncritical progressivists that they're often portrayed as being. But there are some, as you're suggesting, some differences with Hegel. Some of Marx's descriptions of the Indian village and so forth, and Indian civilization as backward, unchanging, unresisting, passive, not really having a history, are almost copied from the section on India in Hegel's Philosophy of History, the same book that you were just quoting. But what I think holds back Marx from being fully Hegelian, although that's certainly his major intellectual influence, one of the things that holds him back is, of course, as everyone points out, that Marx is a more empirical thinker who's actually interested in historical, looking really at historical and social phenomena more deeply than Hegel was, although Hegel did do quite a bit of that. But Marx is also a humanist, and I think that's a big difference. There's an implicit humanism in some of Hegel's writings on the human subject, but in the 1844 critique of Hegel, Marx talks about the abstraction of Hegel's philosophizing, where the real human being, breathing, and the corporeal being, the bodily being, the bodily human being, is not really present, or not present enough in Hegel's thinking. So this fatality, these fatal laws of history or so forth, as Hegel thinks of it, Marx is always a little more reluctant to think in those terms, and especially by the end of his life, where he says, I don't, in response to a Russian, it's sometimes thought of as a Russian critic, but was actually a Russian trying to defend him against other critics. Mikhailovsky was trying to defend Marx. But he said that Marx had a general theory of history, and Marx said, no, I don't have a concept of some kind of a law of history that is inevitably or fatally imposed upon all peoples. So he's a little less global as a thinker in that sense than Hegel, a little less what we call today totalizing, although it's a real caricature to have Hegel as a thinker of totality without room for particularity and difference, because Hegel spent an awful lot of his life attacking what he called the abstract universals.
Well, it seems to me that, in one way we could talk about this question of freedom, self-consciousness, and universality. It seems to me that in important respects, Marx is deeply beholden to Hegel on the question of the project of the self-conscious constitution of history. And of course, that project is radically reconfigured by Marx through his understanding of commodity fetishism and what consciousness means in the struggle to realize and overcome capitalism in an industrial context, but that, like Hegel, he would view very differently retrogression in a context where what Hegel would call the philosophical apprehension of history, the question of where humanity is becoming self-conscious, where it's not just a question of the fatality of the cunning of reason. That Hegel also has that in the modern world there is the question of the free constitution of history. I think Marx inherits that, and that for. I guess again, I feel like for Marx, over the course, that his pessimism, what you're calling his pessimism or his sharpening or harshing, his increasingly harsh and unremitting critique of capital, that really turns on the question of, struggling with a social form that seems recalcitrant to the project of human emancipation. Of course, it's something that he's experiencing over the course of the sort of post-1848 epoch as it begins to open up before him, where, in a sense, he thinks that the task of proletarian revolution has been announced and recognized, and yet humanity is not taking it up. It's in that. I mean, the way I read something like the 1857 writings is that Marx is saying, to the extent that modern society falls below its own possibility, its own threshold, it renounces its, in a sense, title to supersede medieval society.
Right.
So that, where that's not really a question of, for instance, support for the Indian Mutiny, but rather a recognition of a melancholy recognition of a kind of barbarism, a kind of civilized barbarism versus the old barbarism.
Well, there's a lot packed into your comment.
So I'll let you respond for a few minutes to that.
Okay, with the let's start with where you ended with the Indian the Sepoy Uprising of 1857. I mean, we discussed this actually a few other times at some academic conferences. But I mean, I think the letter to Engels of 1858, I believe it is. It's the famous letter where Marx talks about having reread Hegel's logic, and as he's reconstructing some of the categories that were to become, well, actually the Grundrisse at that point, but later, of course, capital. That was a great help to him in some of the economic categories. That's also the same letter where he says the Indians are now our best allies. So I do take that as support for the Sepoy Uprising. But what does support mean? It doesn't mean that he's supporting the political aims of the Sepoy Uprising, which to the extent that they were coordinated aims called for the restoration of the Mughal Empire. Certainly he doesn't support that or anything of that kind. But to the extent
but he has been taken in the past to be supportive of that.
Well, but my take on this stuff is that I think it's very different. Like let's go to Ireland for a second. He's always supporting the Irish national movement, but the degree to which he's critical of it, as opposed to just very enthusiastically supporting it with the critique taking more of a background place, has a lot to do with the social content of the movement and its leadership. In the 1840s, it was led by pro-landlord groups that were very close to the Catholic Church. And Marx and Engels are scathing of these tendencies. By the 1860s, you have the birth of the Fenian movement, which is more peasant-based, not very tied to the church, and attacks the property and is against the property holdings not only of the British but of the so-called Irish landowner classes as well, and supports the tenants, the Irish tenants against landlords, whether British or Irish. So Marx and Engels are much more enthusiastic about the Fenian movement of the 1860s. The Indian movement did not have a socially progressive agenda, the resistance of 1857. So he supports it, but never with the fulsomeness that he later on supports the movement in Ireland.
But how?
All these universals, because we don't, Marx is a supporter of national self-determination, but it's not an abstract universal.
Certainly.
And with Hegel, it isn't either. Any of these kind of, because the most glaring example of how he doesn't support is the American South. He does not support the right to national self-determination of the Confederate States of America, because the political basis and social basis on which that was constructed was the defense of slavery.
Indeed. Okay. Let me ask you about a sort of different aspect of this whole sort of series of concerns. That has to do with the discussion in the book about modes of production, Asiatic mode of production,
right,
and the like. And for instance, on page 158, you seem to specify by what you mean by a unilinear model that Marx is breaking with, by noting that this would take the form of a purportedly universal philosophy of history that focused on Western, this is quoting you, focused on Western development from early stateless clan societies to the ancient Greco-Roman class societies based on slave labor, to the feudalism of the Middle Ages, and on to bourgeois society and its successor, socialism.
Right.
But as you point out, all pre-capitalist societies, for all of their empirical variety, share, for Marx, the crucial theoretical aspect of being pre-capitalist, in the sense that, as you put it at one point, the purpose of their labor was not the creation of value. That these were not societies in which people, in which labor formed a primary social relation, and a highly opaque and abstract social relation at that. And so it seems to me that there's a tension in Marx kind of throughout, between making a claim about all of human history and making a claim about the specificity of capital.
Right.
And that we would never want to, in a sense, let go of that tension. In fact, that tension is actually saying something about the epochal character of capitalism. I mean, to what extent do you think that the idea that Marx had a philosophy of history, that there were modes of production, that one passed, that one worked out its own inner contradictions to, in a sense, issue into the next, from nature to the end of history, to what extent do you think Marx ever really held that view?
Well, I'm not sure the extent to which he held it or not, because I haven't really thought that through. But I think I could say that it's not something he spent a lot of intellectual effort on.
Mm-hmm.
There's that long section in the Grundrisse on pre-capitalist modes of production, which talks about the Greco-Roman mode of production and the ancient, Asiatic, as he calls it. He's really talking mainly about India, as far as I can tell there. Now, a lot of people say, well, how much did Marx write on the Asiatic mode of production? Well, not that much. I mean, he wrote a lot of stuff about India, but the phrase Asiatic mode of production hardly ever occurs in his journalistic writings on India. I don't think it even occurs at all. And, I used to think for a long time that, well, there must be a long essay somewhere by Marx describing the feudal mode of production. Well, there isn't. It's just a few scattered comments here and there, as far as I can tell, probably less than what he ever wrote about the so-called Asiatic mode of production. Here's the way I've tended to think about this. Marx was not Max Weber. Max Weber was a scholar who spent perhaps most of his intellectual effort on trying to figure out the uniqueness of capitalism vis-a-vis earlier social formations. And of course, with that whole religious framework through which he looked, but it's really about culture and economy as much as it's about religion. So you had China, you had India, you had the ancient Judaism, ancient Roman Greece, of course, and the Middle Age, European Middle Ages. So Weber does systematic work over hundreds, thousands of pages on this. With Marx, I think the concerns are very different. He does look at these kinds of issues sometimes. I mean, he does look at it in the Grundrisse, at the historical, it goes back into pre-modern Indian society and history and so forth. But I think with Marx, it's always with contemporary concerns in mind. Not only about the structure of capitalism, but the structure of capitalism in order to figure out the problematic of resistance and revolution to capital. Marx gets interested in the Russian and Indian villages at the end of his life because he thinks, I believe, that these were possible loci of resistance to capital that could become allies of the Western proletariat.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that, so Marx is much more concerned, as you were saying, with capital in the present day, I mean his present of the 19th century, to the extent that he's concerned with the non-West, whether it's or the non-core capitalist countries like Ireland, it's because of their relationship to the problematic of capital and labor inside the core countries. And sometimes he thinks these relationships can reverse themselves. Like he thinks that toward the end of his life, or the late 1860s, that an Irish revolution could become the lever that might spark a more class-based uprising inside Britain. Mm-hmm. At the end of his life, he's saying that the Russian communal village could be the starting point for a global communist development if it could link up with the proletarian movement in the West.
Mm-hmm.
But it's never isolated, and it's never certainly never for the sake of figuring out a philosophy of history or theory of history. Now, there may be a very interesting philosophy or theory of history there, but that would have to be teased out, and people have tried to do that and so forth.
Yeah, I guess my anxiety is that, the whole preoccupation with Eurocentrism really occludes the fact that, and this goes back to an earlier point that I made, or question, is it really loses sight of the fact that revolution was, according to Marx, possible in his own time, and that meant a question of what will be the place, what will be the role of India, how will the transition to post-capitalist society, hopefully, globally take place, and that that his discussions of those societies are going to be radically transformed, and that their current barbarism is going to become a society
right, but
of
don't forget
free
that he also
association.
talks about the barbarism of capitalism and colonialism.
Right.
In 1853.
Indeed, that there will be a transformation, that there'll be the overcoming of prehistory, right? A category that ties both of those together. And that for many people who throw around a category like Eurocentrism, revolution was no more possible now than it was then, and they're not interested in either case.
Well, I think it's true of most academic thinking, even left-wing academic thinking, that revolution is probably not possible. I mean, even a school of thinking for which I have great respect, the Frankfurt School, has devoted most of its energy to figuring out why the German working class, and then later on the modern Western working classes in America and so forth, were non-revolutionary, were not even really oppositional anymore, as you saw in a book like Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man. Mm-hmm. So this kind of goes along with the territory of academic radicalism. But I think Marx was not an academic, and Marx, let's face it, Capital was not written with an academic audience in mind.
Indeed.
I believe, I think the correspondence bears this out, that Marx thought books like The Critique of Political Economy and Capital were to be read by working class audiences. If intellectuals also read them, great. But he saw them as aimed at a working class, left-wing, activist audience above all. And it wasn't people can laugh at that all they want, but Samuel Gompers recounts that when in the early days of the AFL, that he was a cigar maker, and they used to sit around. There was no YouTube, there was no television or radio at that time, so the cigar makers there'd be a bunch of them in a room, and they'd hire someone to read a book to them. And he said, that's how I read Capital, was that we hired a reader to read it to us. And so back from Marx's day to now, there were these educated and often self-educated workers. Rosa Luxemburg taught at most of her writing is developed out of lectures he gave to the Social Democratic Party School for labor organizers. So that is what Marx was interested in. But he was also interested in how that could be extended to places like Ireland, China, India, Russia, where there wasn't a working class developed yet, and yet there were radical intellectuals, and there were peasants who had revolutionary
impulses,
dimensions and impulses. Yeah,
Kevin, I want to really thank you for agreeing to be on the show. It's been great talking to you. I could talk to you for another hour or three, but we're out of time. I'll get in touch with you to see what you thought about our conversation and to send you a recording of it.
Well, thanks very much for having me on the show.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciated the conversation.
Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to a conversation with Professor Kevin Anderson, author of Marx at the Margins, here on Radical Minds, WHPK 88.5 FM, the pride of the South Side. It's currently 3:59 p.m.
A new generation.